They thought they could push me around like some clueless tenant. But what the HOA didn't realize was that I owned the entire block, every single house, every square inch, every driveway, where they claimed I had too many cars parked. And I wasn't about to sit back and let them bleed me dry with made-up fees. This is a story about control, arrogance, and how one Karen-led HOA tried to take on a man who not only knew his rights, but had the deeds to prove them. And if you've ever dealt with HOA nonsense or just love watching karma hit back hard, then you're going to want to stick around to the end of this story. And don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories because you won't believe how far this one goes. It all started when I parked my third vehicle in front of one of the homes I owned and got a formal notice from the HOA that I was violating the community car limit rule. Now, I'd received notices before, but this one came with a hefty fine and a threat to raise my HOA fees if the issue continued. At first, I thought it was a mistake, because how could they not know I was the owner? But when I called the office, I got a cold, clipped response from a woman named Denise, the HOA president, telling me the rules applied to everyone equally, and that if I didn't like it, I could park elsewhere. Her tone was smug, like she'd just handed out a punishment and expected me to cower. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just parking my cars on the property. I was paying property taxes on all 12 houses in that community, including the one she rented. I inherited the block from my late uncle, who built it decades ago and never handed control over to the HOA when it was formed. The homes were fully owned, debt-free, and leased to tenants who knew me well. I didn't usually flex ownership unless I had to, but this time, Denise had crossed a line. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. My mail went missing, my trash bins were left overturned, and anonymous complaints showed up in my inbox. One tenant told me that HOA members were knocking on doors asking how long visitors stayed and how many vehicles each resident owned. It was clear they were on a mission to build a case against me, but I had no intention of playing defense. I gathered every deed, tax receipt, utility bill, and lease agreement, and prepared for war. The next HOA board meeting was a public one, and I showed up early, sitting front and center as Denise strutted in like she was hosting a courtroom drama.
Alleys.
3 other board members sat flanking her, smug and ready to rattle off violations. When it came to community complaints, Denise pulled up a PowerPoint slide with a photo of my driveway and said, "This resident has consistently violated the HOA's car limit rule. The board has voted to increase his fees to reflect this." Abuse of space. She didn't even look at me, just clicked her mouse and moved on. I raised my hand calmly and stood when acknowledged. "I'd like to clarify something," I said. "That property you referenced, that's one of 12 that I own on this block." There was an audible shift in the room. Denise narrowed her eyes, confused, until I pulled a thick folder from my bag and laid out copies of property deeds on the table. "This one's mine, and so is that one, and that one, and funny enough, so is yours, Denise. You're leasing. From me. You pay rent to a property management company I control." The color drained from her face. The boardroom went silent except for the quiet rustling of papers. I continued. "I've allowed the HOA to operate out of courtesy, but if you plan to continue penalizing me and threatening me with fines on properties I own outright, then I'll have no choice but to revoke HOA privileges from the properties under my name, which makes up over 70% of this block." Denise tried to recover, stammering something about bylaws and community standards, but it was clear she hadn't done her homework. I had the legal standing, the paper trail, and now the support of multiple tenants who were fed up with the HOA's intrusive behavior. One by one, residents stood up to voice their experiences, unfair citations, inspections without notice, aggressive tone from board members, and the latest ridiculous move, placing parking boot warnings on vehicles that hadn't even been there more than a few hours. I let them speak. I didn't need to rally them. The HOA had done that all on their own. When the meeting adjourned, Denise cornered me in the parking lot and said, "You think owning the houses gives you the right to ignore the rules?" I calmly replied, "No, owning the houses gives me the right to set the rules." Then I walked away. That night, I drafted a formal letter to the board revoking HOA authority from all 12 of my properties. Effective immediately, I also informed. The tenants that HOA notices or fines were no longer valid for their homes unless I personally approved them. That's when the real chaos started. Denise, unwilling to lose control, began targeting the remaining homeowners, trying to pressure them into demanding I reinstate HOA access. But instead of siding with her, they began asking questions she couldn't answer. Why were fees increasing every quarter? Why were maintenance requests delayed? Why were new community rules being passed without proper votes? House of Cards started collapsing, and fast. Within weeks, 2 board members resigned, citing personal stress. Tenants and owners alike began petitioning for a vote to dissolve the HOA altogether. Meanwhile, I filed a formal complaint with the city's housing authority, highlighting the HOA's overreach, unauthorized inspections, and harassment. I even included video footage from my security cams of HOA reps snooping around homes, measuring driveways, and taking photos of cars like private investigators. The investigation was officially opened, and suddenly Denise wasn't so cocky anymore. But that's only the beginning. You won't believe what she tried next to claw back her power and how it backfired in the most public way possible. Denise couldn't handle the humiliation from the last board meeting. And even though I had already revoked HOA jurisdiction over my properties, she launched into a desperate, erratic campaign to force me into compliance or drive me out entirely. Over the next week, she plastered unauthorized parking warnings on every one of my tenants' cars, even though they were all legally parked on private driveways. She left leaflets on my own porch warning of pending litigation if I continued to undermine the HOA's authority, which would have been laughable if it weren't so petty. The flyers had no legal basis and were clearly just designed to scare other homeowners into thinking I was breaking some law. But Denise's tactics were starting to crack her own foundation. People were no longer afraid of her. I got calls from neighbors who said she came to their homes uninvited, trying to explain the danger I posed to the community and urging them to sign a petition that would force the HOA to take legal action against me. But when residents asked what action she planned to take and under what authority, she became flustered and evasive. One elderly couple even caught her peering over their backyard fence with a clipboard, taking notes on their patio furniture. That was when they decided to go directly to the city and file their own complaint. Denise's image as the protector of the neighborhood was unraveling fast. I kept quiet on the surface, but behind the scenes, I was gathering evidence and building a case. I installed new security cameras on each of the properties. I owned discreet but high definition and captured footage of HOA members trespassing, leaving warning notes, and even instructing landscapers to trim bushes on property they had no authority over. I knew she was pushing for something bigger than just car fines. She wanted to set an example with me to keep her grip on the neighborhood. But I also suspected that the HOA's finances weren't as clean as they claimed, so I filed a request under the state's Homeowners Association Transparency Act, demanding access to all HOA budgets, expenditure reports, and meeting minutes from the past 2 years. The HOA had no choice but to respond, and what I found made my blood boil. The numbers didn't add up. Nearly $38,000 in miscellaneous administrative costs, thousands spent on security enhancements that no one could identify, and reimbursements to board members for community outreach events that never happened. I had receipts. None of them matched, and worst of all, a large payment had been made to a private investigator only a month earlier. The same month, they started targeting my properties. When I presented the findings at the next community meeting, the room was packed and the tension was electric. I began by reading aloud the line item: payment to Summit Surveillance, $4,250. Then I looked directly at Denise and said, "Why is the HOA paying private investigators to follow residents?" She froze. Her voice cracked as she tried to deflect, saying it was for general safety and suspicious activity monitoring. But it was clear she had no idea I'd found the invoice that listed my name and address under subject of surveillance. Gasps filled the room. Homeowners began shouting, demanding explanations, asking why their dues were being used to stalk a landlord. That's when one board member, the treasurer, Mike, stood up and walked to my side. I had no idea about any of this. he said. She bypassed the board. These payments never came across my desk. The room exploded. Several homeowners stormed out. Others demanded Denise resign on the spot. And the remaining board members began arguing amongst themselves. I didn't need to say another word. The truth was speaking loud enough. But Denise wasn't done. The next morning, 2 unmarked vehicles appeared outside one of my homes. 2 men got out, both dressed like security officers, but wearing no badges, and began knocking on doors asking questions about the owner. One tenant called me in a panic and I drove straight there. When I arrived and asked who they were, they claimed to be from HOA compliance enforcement and tried to show me laminated ID cards with no government seal, no agency name, just generic titles. I told them to leave immediately or I'd call the police. They refused, so I did. The sheriff's deputy arrived within 15 minutes and questioned them both. Turns out, they weren't cops, and they had no legal authority to be on private property. They were hired contractors from a shady local firm, the same one tied to the surveillance invoice. They were escorted off the premises and warned never to return. I filed another complaint, this time a formal police report citing impersonation of officers and harassment. That incident was the final straw for many residents. The same day, a petition began circulating to remove the entire HOA board and dissolve the HOA entirely. Denise was cornered. Her web of control had collapsed, and now legal consequences were knocking on her door. But she still had one last trick. A few days later, I received a letter from a law firm representing the HOA, claiming I had violated neighborhood harmony ordinances by disrupting standard operations and inciting public unrest. The letter was weak, full of vague accusations and zero legal footing, but the intent was clear: intimidation. What she didn't realize was that I had already retained my own attorney, who fired back with a cease and desist order, citing targeted harassment, breach of community trust, and misuse of funds. Attached were signed affidavits from 7 homeowners, 3 of my tenants, and 2 former board members, all testifying to the HOA's misconduct. That letter marked the beginning of a full-scale civil suit. But I didn't just want damages or retribution. I wanted to ensure that no HOA could ever weaponize their authority like this again. That's when I began working with a local legal reform group focused on HOA accountability. With their help, I drafted a proposal for a new ordinance in our municipality that would require all HOAs to submit financial audits annually, prohibit surveillance without cause or court approval, and ban fines unless authorized by municipal code. While that was being drafted and reviewed by city officials, the neighborhood moved faster. Majority vote dissolved the HOA within a month, and Denise was forced to resign. But what happened after she left shocked even me. I thought things would calm down after the HOA was dissolved, and Denise stepped down in disgrace, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of retreating quietly, she went rogue, escalating her tactics from bureaucratic harassment to personal vendettas. With her official title gone, she started rallying her own little circle of loyalist former board members, bitter neighbors, and even a few outsiders with grudges of their own, forming what felt more like a vigilante group than a neighborhood watch. They began following my tenants in unmarked cars, parking across the street from my homes with binoculars, pretending to be private security and taking pictures of license plates. One of my renters, a single mother with 2 kids, called me crying after finding a note on her windshield that read, "Wrong kind of people don't belong here." That's when I knew Denise had moved into dangerous territory. This was no longer about HOA policies. This was a personal war she was waging, and she wasn't going to stop until she destroyed everything I had built. But I wasn't about to let her. I reached out to the same legal reform group that had helped me draft the HOA reform ordinance and asked for assistance filing a restraining order, not just against Denise, but against the entire group she was organizing. I presented evidence, video clips, witness statements, the threatening note, even dashcam footage from one of my tenants' cars, showing they were being followed to work by a black SUV registered to Denise's cousin. The court granted a temporary restraining order within days. But the real blow came when I filed a civil harassment suit that named Denise and 3 of her former board allies directly. Once they were served, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. But Denise responded with a smug smirk, telling anyone who'd listen that I was just trying to play the victim. What she didn't expect was that the local news had picked up the story. A journalist from the community paper reached out for comment, and after reviewing the documents, she published an article titled, "Landlord Sues Former HOA for Stalking, Harassment." It included photos of the warning notes, quotes from my tenants, and screenshots from surveillance footage. The article went viral locally, and within 48 hours, the city council announced an emergency review of how private organizations like HOAs could be regulated. That should have been the end of it, but instead Denise doubled down. She filed a countersuit, claiming I was orchestrating a smear campaign against her and damaging her reputation. But what she didn't know was that during discovery, her entire web of lies would come crashing down. My legal team obtained emails between Denise and a private security contractor where she instructed them to monitor specific households, including mine, and report back on daily activity. It was chilling. Worse, there was a payment trail, 3 separate transfers from her personal account, not even routed through the HOA's former accounts, showing she was bankrolling this intimidation campaign on her own. We presented it all to the judge during the preliminary hearing, and Denise's lawyer, clearly blindsided, immediately requested a recess. The judge not only upheld my restraining order, but expanded it to include anyone acting under Denise's direction. But the damage had already been done. Several of my tenants, afraid for their safety, gave notice and moved out early. I had empty properties, legal bills stacking up, and a growing sense that Denise was spiraling into something more unhinged. Then came the moment everything changed. One night around 2 a.m., I got a frantic call from one of my remaining tenants, who lived in the corner house of the block. She said there were 3 men outside dressed in dark uniforms, pounding on her door, shouting they were there for code enforcement. She was terrified. I told her to stay inside, lock every door, and call 911 while I drove over immediately. When I arrived, I saw the men black tactical gear, heavy boots, no visible ID standing in her yard with flashlights. I pulled up fast and stepped out with my phone recording, asking who they were. One of them pointed at me and said I was interfering with an official investigation. I asked what agency they were with. They refused to answer. That's when I called it in myself and said loud and clear, "I'm reporting armed impersonators." On private property. Within 10 minutes, 2 unmarked SUVs screeched onto the scene. Out stepped federal agents, FBI. Not local police, not sheriffs, the real deal. Apparently, they'd been monitoring similar impersonation complaints and had a task force investigating fraudulent code enforcers targeting homeowners across the region. But this incident confirmed everything. They weren't just impersonators. They were organized, and Denise was the connection. One of the men had a phone on him that showed text messages from a number registered to Denise's cousin, providing addresses, instructions, and even warning them to avoid cameras. The FBI agents took all 3 men into custody, and I stood there, still in disbelief, watching them get cuffed on the very street where Denise once ruled with HOA citations and smug superiority. The agents took statements from my tenant, reviewed my surveillance footage, and even asked for access to my previous legal filings. One of the agents told me privately, "We've been watching this group for months. What you gave us tonight just opened the door wider than we could have hoped." I realized then that this wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. This was a coordinated effort to terrorize homeowners under the guise of authority. And Denise? She had just linked herself directly to a federal criminal investigation. The next day, her house was raided. The FBI served a search warrant, seizing her phone, her computer, and multiple boxes from her garage. I didn't need to ask what they found. I already knew it wasn't going to be good for her. But even then, the fallout was only beginning. When news of the FBI raid on Denise's home spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, it was no longer a story about a bitter ex-HOA president clinging to power. It became something darker, more sinister. For years, residents had whispered about strange things. Sono explained: surveillance vans, sudden home inspections without city paperwork, petty fines that seemed made up. Hand now, all of it began to make sense. Denise wasn't just orchestrating a neighborhood vendetta. She was part of a sprawling web of private enforcers who had been impersonating code officers, zoning officials, and even law enforcement to intimidate property owners into compliance, sell homes under duress, or seize them through dirty tactics. The agents showed up again the day after the raid, but this time, not in secret. They parked 3 black SUVs right in front of the HOA clubhouse, now boarded up since its closure, and began interviewing neighbors one by one. I watched from across the street as they carried out boxes of documents, some marked with Denise's handwriting and others labeled board records. It was a surreal sight of gents flipping through HOA meeting minutes like they were tracking mafia money laundering. But what shook me most was what they shared with me privately later that evening, according to their investigation. Denise had been cooperating with a private enforcement firm that had ties to several other HOAs across the state. The company's name was Innocuous Civic Guardian LLC, but what they did was anything but. They offered compliance solutions to struggling HOA boards, which included aggressive enforcement, intimidation, forced turnover of homes deemed abandoned or violating covenants. They provided fake uniforms, letterheads, and sometimes even fraudulent inspection documents to justify their actions. And Denise, she wasn't just a client, she was one of their regional recruiters. The FBI showed me a recovered email chain between Denise and a Civic Guardian executive discussing how she had successfully flipped several properties through fear and noncompliance threats. One sentence burned into my brain. The landlord. At 814 Oak is pushing back hard, he'll need extra persuasion. That was my address. They had been targeting me from the start. This wasn't about HOA dues or too many cars in a driveway. This was about control. It's about seeing my ownership of the entire block as a threat to their influence. And Denise, driven by her personal grudge and craving for control, had sold out her neighbors to a scheme that used fear and fake authority to steal property. But while the agents worked on the criminal side, I turned my attention to the civil courts. I filed a massive lawsuit against Civic Guardian LLC, Denise, and every HOA board member who had signed off on her actions over the last 5 years. My lawyers brought in forensic accountants, expert witnesses, and civil rights attorneys to build a case not just on harassment and fraud, but on conspiracy to violate property rights. The media latched onto the story again, and this time it went national. Headlines read, "Fake officers, real damage, how a rogue HOA tried to seize a whole neighborhood." Reporters camped out in front of my house and begged for interviews. I gave just one where I told the public exactly what happened and how. Denise and her network operated under the illusion of community protection, but the interview that changed everything wasn't mine. It was from a former Civic Guardian employee who had fled the company 2 years ago after learning what they were really doing. She went on record, anonymously at first, describing how they forged municipal documents, threatened low-income homeowners with arrest, and sometimes even paid off local inspectors to look the other way. Her whistleblower testimony added a nuclear level. Layer to our case. The feds raided Civic Guardian's headquarters 2 weeks later. Dozens of boxes were taken. Servers, laptops, hard drives, all carted off by agents in blue windbreakers. The entire neighborhood watched it unfold live on cable news, jaws dropping as the anchor explained how a so-called homeowners protection service had infiltrated neighborhoods across 3 states. But even then, Denise wouldn't go quietly. She held one last press conference, standing on the front lawn of her now infamous yellow colonial house, flanked by her lawyer. Her hair was perfectly curled, and she wore the same smug look I'd seen for years. "These accusations are a distraction," she said. "This is a witch hunt against strong community leaders." But the smirk finally faded when during the live feed an FBI agent walked up, handed her attorney a new set of charges, and quietly said, "You've just been named in a federal RICO investigation. Racketeering, fraud, harassment, impersonating law enforcement." Denise's knees buckled slightly. She steadied herself on the podium. Cameras rolled as she was led back into her house, visibly shaken. She was no longer untouchable, and that moment, more than any court order, more than any news headline, was the justice our neighborhood had needed. But the fight wasn't over yet. The house's Civic Guardian had flipped, were now entangled in complex legal battles with former owners. trying to reclaim their property. Some had already been sold to new families unaware of the fraud. The courts would take years to sort it out. I offered help where I could, donating legal resources and providing statements in support of those who had been victimized. My tenants, once fearful, now held their heads higher, knowing the truth had come out, and that the system, while flawed, could still correct itself. Still, the scars remained. Surveillance cameras stayed up on every house, doors were locked tighter. And late at night, neighbors who once barely spoke to each other now gathered in small groups, checking in, supporting one another, and finally realizing how close they had come to losing everything, and me. I didn't stop at lawsuits. I started lobbying for state legislation that would require mandatory transparency in HOA operations and criminal penalties for impersonating public officials. With the help of other victims and the legal reform group I had worked with earlier, we drafted what became known as the Community Integrity Act. It gained bipartisan support and within 6 months was signed into law, making it one of the strongest anti-fraud measures for HOA accountability in the country. Denise may have started this war thinking she could intimidate me into silence, but instead, she handed me the spotlight, and I used it to make sure no one else could ever be terrorized the way we were. But there was still one final reckoning left, because when the FBI returned for a follow-up, they brought with them a sealed indictment that named a surprising second-tier target, the bank that had processed the Civic Guardian wire transfers. What they uncovered in those financial records shocked us all. The documents the FBI uncovered from the financial audits were staggering in scope and implications. Buried within thousands of wire transfers and laundered transactions was the name of a regional bank first Continental Trust that had been silently enabling Civic Guardian's entire operation for years. At first glance, it appeared to be just another mid-tier institution. It's the kind you'd see in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a donut shop. But once investigators began tracing funds, they realized that First Continental wasn't just facilitating Civic Guardian's payments. They were actively hiding them under shell accounts and routing them through dummy LLCs, many of which were registered under phony names linked to now-defunct HOAs. A senior-level vice president at the bank, Marcus Halston, was found to have approved over 170 suspicious transactions, all flagged internally but dismissed without follow-up. The FBI suspected he was not just negligent but complicit, possibly receiving kickbacks for looking the other way. This turned our case from a neighborhood harassment scandal into a multi-agency, high-profile federal conspiracy involving financial fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. With that new lead, the scope of the civil case widened dramatically. My legal team joined forces with the U.S. Attorney's Office to pursue not just damages but also injunctions that would freeze Civic Guardian's remaining assets and seize their bank accounts before they could launder any more money or flee the country. Meanwhile, the community I once feared would be lost forever began to rally in ways I hadn't imagined. People who had once looked down on renters began reaching out to them with meals, legal support, and friendship. The fake HOA fines were torn up, new homeowners banded together with longtime tenants, hosting community meetings right on the block. It was no longer my block, it was ours. When I spoke to everyone during one of those evening gatherings, I told them what I'd just learned, that this scheme, rooted in our neighborhood, had victimized hundreds of people across the state and beyond. We were just the flashpoint, but now we had a platform. Within days, journalists who had previously written about our case started digging into First Continental's other clients. They discovered dozens of connections between Civic Guardian and various property enforcement firms that all funneled money through the same obscure bank departments. State senators called for public hearings. The Attorney General launched a task force. And through it all, Denise remained silent, sitting in a county detention facility without bail, her legal team crumbling under the weight of the evidence. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, and it came in the form of a digital ledger Civic Guardian had mistakenly backed up on one of the seized servers. Among all the fake inspections, harassment protocols, and forged documents, there was a database called targets_priority_. escalated_list. And my name wasn't just on ITI, was listed as priority number 1. Beneath that heading were notes, photos, surveillance summaries, and even a psychological profile of me. Highly resistant. Financially capable, property rich, likely to file suit, must be neutralized. I felt sick reading it. They'd mapped out a plan to make my life unbearable, to force me out through pressure. Fines, fake enforcement, and eventually a lowball offer on my homes that would be disguised as a settlement opportunity. They'd even mocked up a fake city letter to threaten me with condemnation. It wasn't just fraud. It was warfare. I brought this new data to the FBI, who confirmed it matched other files they'd found in similar raids. And with it, we added attempted property theft and criminal conspiracy to the charges. Denise, when confronted with her role in this list, reportedly broke down during questioning. According to the agents, she admitted everything, not out of remorse, but because she believed her co-conspirators had betrayed her. She named 3 additional Civic Guardian executives and 2 more HOA leaders in other cities who were part of the same network. Her statement unraveled years of secrecy. And for the first time, victims from other towns began showing up to our street meetings, telling their own stories, how their fences were knocked down without notice, how compliance officers banged on their doors demanding entry, how elderly homeowners were manipulated into signing over their deeds. The horror. Stories were everywhere. Some even cried when they saw how we had fought back, refusing to let the system break us. And still, behind the scenes, the FBI and prosecutors were working on something massive, something bigger than all the arrests, fines, and media stories. They were building a case to federally dismantle Civic Guardian and charge its founders. Under the RICO Act, they wanted it labeled as an organized criminal enterprise. And to do that, they needed testimony from victims, experts, insiders, and plaintiffs willing to stand up in court and lay bare every illegal thing that had happened. So I agreed. I stood in a federal courtroom flanked by legal teams, cameras, outside, and described in excruciating detail how they came after me not because of a rule violation, but because I owned too much property to be controlled. I described how they sent fake cops to intimidate me, tried to fine me into submission, threatened my tenants, tapped my utilities, and orchestrated a full-scale psychological campaign to drive me out. I wasn't alone. Over 24 other victims testified as well. By the end of the hearings, even the most skeptical observers realized this wasn't some HOA gone rogue. This was systemic abuse dressed up in legalese, permitted to fester due to loopholes and lack of oversight. Civic Guardian was officially declared a criminal enterprise by the court. All of their assets, estimated at over $72 million, were seized. First Continental Trust's top executives were indicted. Denise, who once wielded power over our street like a tyrant, was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison without parole. But for me, justice wasn't in the headlines or courtrooms. It was when I walked down my block one evening and saw every porch lit up, every house bustling with people laughing, barbecuing, playing music. The community had not only survived, had thrived. But we still had work to do. Because what happened? Here could happen anywhere. And the only way to stop it was to shine a brighter light, speak louder than fear, and keep pushing for accountability. The law might have won this round, but we'd made sure it had a fighting chance in the next. With Civic Guardian dismantled and Denise behind bars, most people would have taken a step back, enjoyed the victory, and returned to their private lives. But not me. Something about the depth of the corruption, the sheer audacity of what they'd built, wouldn't let me rest. I kept thinking about that targets_priority_list and how I had only been the first. There were thousands of files just like mine and the backup names of people. Families, seniors, even veterans, all marked as obstacles, listed with strategies to push them out of their homes, out of their neighborhoods. The cruelty was systematic. So I connected with the FBI again, this time not as a victim, but as a collaborator. They were beginning a much broader investigation into how HOA abuse had metastasized across the country. and they asked me to work with a task force forming at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. My case had sparked a wave of outrage. At the federal level, and lawmakers were finally paying attention to how weaponized these organizations had become. I started flying out to hearings, speaking in front of committees, giving interviews, and helping investigators trace financial links between fraudulent HOAs and slush funds hidden in fake maintenance companies, security firms, and bogus community improvement contracts. It turned out that Civic Guardian wasn't the only organization operating like this. There were others, each with different names but identical playbooks. They used fear, ambiguity, and manipulation to slowly dismantle people's rights under the guise of neighborhood improvement. These weren't communities anymore. They were controlled zones, and anyone who pushed back was crushed. The more I learned, the more I realized my experience had been mild compared to others. In Arizona, a woman was evicted from her home after a board claimed she violated noise rules except she was deaf. In Florida, a veteran with PTSD had his service dog forcibly removed because of a no-pets clause that the board hadn't enforced in years until they decided they wanted him out. In Texas, a black couple's home was condemned over faded paint. Even though they'd repainted it twice only, to have a contractor reveal that the HOA had purposefully used weather-reactive paint that would wash out under UV. The stories kept coming, each one more unbelievable than the last. And everywhere I went, I kept hearing one phrase: "We thought we were the only ones." That's when I realized that Civic Guardian's greatest weapon hadn't been fake fines or scare tactics. It was isolation. They made you feel alone, like no one else would believe you, like resistance was futile. But the truth was, we were never alone. We'd just been silenced. So I started a public coalition, Homeowner Justice Alliance. It began with just a few of us from my neighborhood, but within weeks, we had hundreds of members from across the country: victims, lawyers, whistleblowers, former board members with a conscience. Everyone who'd been touched by this nightmare came together to share evidence, strategies, and most importantly, support. We opened a hotline, helped victims find attorneys, and lobbied for laws that would finally put teeth behind HOA accountability. And as the alliance grew, so did the pressure on lawmakers. I testified in 3 states, pushing for HOA transparency acts, financial audit requirements, and board term limits. We even got national press coverage when a retired federal judge joined our cause after discovering his own son had been harassed by an HOA for installing a wheelchair ramp. That story struck a nerve. Suddenly, what had seemed like a niche issue was on primetime news, and with it came momentum. Bills began to pass. Task forces were funded. Civil rights attorneys began offering pro bono help to victims, but the work was dangerous too. In one case, a whistleblower we were helping in Nevada had her car vandalized. In another, a community organizer in Georgia received anonymous threats. We knew we were poking a bear. These organizations had money, reach, and deeply entrenched power. But we also knew we couldn't stop, especially not when a quiet, frightened woman named Shirley approached me one day after a speaking event. She looked like anyone's grandmother, soft-spoken, polite, probably in her 70s. But the story she whispered to me was horrifying. Her husband had died after their HOA refused to allow an ambulance onto their gated street because the guard didn't recognize the license plate. She showed me court documents where the HOA had been sued and settled privately. No media coverage, no consequences. It's just a check and a gag order. Shirley had kept quiet for years. But when she saw what we were doing, she wanted to speak. I flew her to Washington myself. When she told her story in front of the subcommittee, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. In that moment, cracked something open. Floodgates of testimony followed. Victims who'd been paid to stay quiet were now emboldened to break their silence. Lawyers from old cases came forward. We began to uncover a whole cottage industry of legal firms that specialized in helping corrupt HOAs dodge lawsuits by targeting the weakest plaintiffs and settling fast before the media caught wind. It was a whole machine, designed not just to harass but to erase the victims afterward. But not anymore. Our alliance wasn't just stopping harassment, we're dismantling the infrastructure that let it thrive. I spent weeks reviewing financial reports, following money trails, helping identify shell companies, and documenting patterns in how these fake enforcement groups operated. Every time we uncovered a new Civic Guardian clone, we shut them down. We helped expose a group in Illinois that had billed residents for water testing that was never conducted, another in Oregon that fined homeowners for roof repairs they never requested in, then sent crews to rip off perfectly good shingles and replace them with cheaper ones, pocketing the difference. These weren't isolated incidents. This was nationwide fraud. It all led back to a small group of companies that supplied the fake enforcement infrastructure phone, security firms, template legal documents, digital ID badge printers, and mobile app surveillance tools sold specifically to HOA boards who wanted to control without consequence. We even found one company that offered compliance coaching where they trained HOA officers on psychological leverage tactics. That company shut down within 48 hours of our press release going live. But one last mystery remained. How had Denise and her kind gotten access to police-grade equipment and uniforms? The answer came in a shocking twist. An ex-police quartermaster in another state had been selling surplus gear under the table to private security organizations with HOA connections. Tactical belts, vests, even untraceable badge replicas. It was all for sale. The FBI arrested him on multiple charges, and that final piece of the puzzle brought everything full circle. We had started with a fake cop knocking on my door, and now we had uncovered the supply chain behind it. The Civic Guardian was just the beginning. But thanks to relentless investigation, legal action, and a growing national movement, we were finally making sure the darkness they operated in could no longer protect them. The true power of a movement is not in the noise it makes at its peak, but in the silence it breaks for those who thought no one would ever hear them, and as our coalition continued to grow, that silence shattered in every state neighborhood and street corner where HOA corruption had long been protected by fear, apathy, and silence. Within months of Shirley's testimony and the exposure of the surplus police equipment scandal, federal hearings were underway. Several states passed emergency legislation mandating audits of every HOA, operating with over 50 homes and more than $250,000 in annual dues. Civil lawsuits multiplied across the country. Journalists started dedicating entire columns to stories from homeowners who were finally emboldened to speak. And our Homeowner Justice Alliance began partnering with state attorney generals, who now saw a clear legal precedent to prosecute fake HOA police groups under RICO statutes, classifying them as criminal enterprises. But for me, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or courtroom wins. It was in the individual letters and messages that poured in every day. A retired couple in Utah finally won back the deed to their house after a 10-year court battle. Single mother in Michigan had a lien removed and got a public apology from a board president who stepped down in shame. In Georgia, a man who'd been wrongly jailed for obstruction when he challenged a board's towing policy was released and later awarded a 6-figure settlement after our lawyers proved the security guard who called the cops wasn't even licensed. Each story reminded me why I never stopped pushing. But with all the progress, there were still pockets of resistance. Some HOAs began rebranding, changing their names and hiding their records. Others formed resident leadership groups to mask their continued use of third-party enforcers. It became clear that the corruption didn't just go away adapted. So we adapted too. I helped launch an online database where residents could anonymously report their HOA's behavior, upload documents, video evidence, and link to financial records. We called it Clear HOA. It exploded overnight. Residents from over 40 states began submitting materials, and soon we had a national map of abuses, with patterns emerging that even shocked federal investigators. It revealed clusters of the same violations using the same legal forms, sometimes even the same notaries, across different cities and states. This wasn't just coincidence, it was syndicate-level operation. The Department of Justice launched a multi-year probe, and we were tapped as civilian consultants. I never imagined that the BBQ I hosted at my own cabina, gathering to celebrate a few good neighbors, would spiral into the unearthing of a national abuse structure. But that's the reality of unchecked authority in the hands of the wrong people. Creeps in quietly, hidden behind bylaws, badges, and bureaucratic walls. It doesn't stop until someone slams the brakes. That someone turned out to be all of us, the homeowners, the whistleblowers, the investigators, and even the journalists who refused to look away. The day we received news that Civic Guardian's founder, operating under 3 aliases and multiple shell companies, had been sentenced to 47 years in federal prison, I stood outside the courthouse with hundreds of others from our alliance. Some were crying, some were cheering. All of us were relieved. Not because one man went to jail, but because for the first time, a system that thrived on invisibility had been fully seen. In the weeks that followed, I stepped away from public leadership, choosing instead to advise quietly from the background. The movement had outgrown any one person, and that was the goal from the beginning, to make sure this would never again depend on one voice shouting in the dark. Instead, it would be thousands speaking in unison. My neighborhood was now unrecognizable from the place where this all began. The fake fines were erased. The corrupted board was gone. The Civic Guardian signs were torn down, replaced by a simple new sign that read, "Community first, accountability always." The residents even voted to dissolve the HOA entirely and form a cooperative instead, where decisions were made democratically, finances were transparent, and no one had arbitrary power over their neighbors. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my property in peace. I added new landscaping, a deck extension, and even built a permanent BBQ pit in honor of that night, the night that began it all. And every summer since, I've hosted that same BBQ, inviting new families who've moved in, along with members of the Homeowner Justice Alliance who now travel the country training others on how to fight back. At our last gathering, a young man approached me nervously. He was probably in his 20s, clutching a folder of documents. He told me his parents had lost their home 5 years ago in a suspicious HOA foreclosure. He'd just reopened the case thanks to evidence our group uncovered, and now he was going to law school because of what we did. That moment, more than any award or headline, reminded me what this was always about. Not just justice, but transformation. Turning pain into power, fear into fuel, silence into strategy. Because at the end of the day, the story wasn't about me, or even about the HOA that tried to control me. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, didn't matter, or didn't have a voice finding out they do. If you're watching this now and going through something similar, know this: you are not alone. There are more of us than there are of them. Speak up. Document everything. Don't let intimidation win. The law is finally on your side. The public is listening, and we will help. Because this fight didn't end with my story. It began with yours. And together, we are reclaiming every block, every street.